The car had been sitting in Los Angeles for months. By the time investigators opened the trunk, the case had already become a missing person investigation, a homicide investigation, and a mystery that had drawn attention far beyond the neighborhood where it began. Inside that Tesla was the body of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. The vehicle was registered to David Anthony Burke, a young musician better known to millions of fans as D4vd. But the discovery in September 2025 was only the beginning. Investigators would eventually trace the case back through months of communications, a relationship prosecutors say began when Celeste was still a child, a 2024 welfare check at Burke's home, and a series of events that prosecutors now say led to her death in April 2025. Then came the evidence: a phone, messages, location data, DNA, financial records, online purchases, and testimony presented during a 5-day preliminary hearing that gave the public its clearest look yet at what prosecutors believe happened between Celeste and Burke. But there is another side to this case. Burke has pleaded not guilty. His defense has challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence and has disputed the allegations against him. And after hearing the evidence, a judge has now ruled that there is enough to send the case forward to trial. That decision does not mean Burke has been found guilty. It means the case has reached the point where a jury will eventually have to decide whether the prosecution can prove its allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. And at the center of everything is one question: what happened between Celeste Rivas Hernandez and David Anthony Burke in the days before April 23, 2025, and what happened after that? To understand why this case has reached this point, we have to go back before the Tesla, before the arrest, and before the courtroom. We have to start with Celeste. Welcome to Bryan Case Record. Before we continue, this case involves the death of a child and allegations of sexual abuse and homicide. Some of the evidence discussed in court is disturbing, although we will avoid unnecessary graphic details. If you're new here, subscribe to Bryan Case Record. We focus on the evidence, the timeline, and the unanswered questions behind serious cases, and we return when new developments change the story. And to everyone who has already subscribed, watched, commented, liked, and shared our videos, thank you. Your support helps us continue researching these cases and bringing attention to stories that deserve careful examination. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Before Celeste Rivas Hernandez became the center of a homicide investigation, she was a 14-year-old girl living a life that had nothing to do with courtrooms, detectives, or national headlines. That part of her story matters, because as the investigation unfolded, the public learned more and more about the circumstances of her death, but much less about the person she had been before it. Celeste was from Lake Elsinore, California. Her family has described her as someone who enjoyed singing and dancing. Like many teenagers, she was growing up, forming friendships, and navigating the complicated years between childhood and adulthood. But her life also became increasingly difficult for investigators to reconstruct. Celeste had been reported missing more than once. Authorities had previously encountered her as a missing juvenile, and the circumstances surrounding those earlier episodes would later become relevant to the investigation into her relationship with Burke. One of the most significant incidents occurred in February 2024. Celeste had again been reported missing. Investigators went to a residence connected to Burke as part of a welfare check. What happened during that visit would become an important piece of evidence more than 2 years later. According to testimony and reporting from the preliminary hearing, deputies questioned Burke about Celeste. In body camera footage played in court, Burke was heard discussing what he believed her age to be. He reportedly said she had told him she was older, while also acknowledging that he had heard she was 13. That moment became significant because prosecutors later argued that Burke had been directly informed of Celeste's age. The defense, however, has challenged aspects of the prosecution's account of the relationship and has argued that Burke was misled about her age at different points. Those competing positions would eventually become part of the criminal case. But the February 2024 welfare check was not the end of the relationship. According to the prosecution's evidence, it continued, and investigators would later find digital records that they say revealed far more about the connection between the two. That evidence would become central to understanding what prosecutors believe happened in the months that followed. David Anthony Burke was not a household name when investigators first began examining his connection to Celeste. But by 2025, that was changing. Professionally known as D4vd, Burke had built a rapidly growing music career through the internet and social media. His rise was unusually fast. He became known for songs that spread through platforms such as TikTok, eventually building an international audience. One of his best-known songs was Romantic Homicide. That title would later take on an uncomfortable significance after Burke became the subject of a real homicide investigation. But it is important not to confuse the song with the criminal case. The song existed years before the investigation and is not evidence of anything that happened to Celeste. By 2025, Burke's career was moving quickly. He had developed a significant following and had signed with Interscope Records. He was no longer simply an unknown young artist posting music online. He was becoming a recognizable name in the music industry, and prosecutors now argue that this growing career became relevant to the alleged motive in the case. Their theory is that Burke feared the exposure of his relationship with Celeste could damage his career. According to prosecutors, the relationship was not simply a private matter. They alleged that it involved illegal sexual conduct with a minor and that Celeste had information that could expose Burke. The prosecution's theory is that this created a motive to silence her. But that is the prosecution's argument. It is not a fact established by a conviction. Burke has pleaded not guilty, and the defense has disputed the allegations. That distinction will remain important throughout this documentary, because the evidence presented so far has raised serious questions, but the ultimate burden remains with the prosecution. And the first question is not what happened on the night Celeste died. It is how this relationship began in the first place. According to prosecutors, Celeste and Burke first became acquainted in 2022. She was approximately 11 years old. Burke was an adult. The exact circumstances surrounding their earliest contact have been the subject of conflicting accounts, and the prosecution and defense have presented different interpretations of what Burke knew about Celeste's age. But investigators eventually recovered a large amount of digital evidence from Burke's phone. That evidence, prosecutors say, provided a window into the relationship. The messages reportedly showed that the relationship developed over time. Prosecutors allege that it eventually became sexual when Celeste was 13. The evidence presented during the preliminary hearing also included communications concerning pregnancy and an abortion in early 2024. These details are important to the case because prosecutors argue they demonstrate the nature and seriousness of the relationship long before Celeste's death. But they also raise another question. If investigators were later able to find evidence of this relationship on Burke's phone, how much did other people know about it while Celeste was alive? That question became part of the preliminary hearing as well. A money manager who worked with Burke testified about what he knew regarding Celeste. According to reporting from the hearing, he knew her first name, but said he did not understand the full nature of the relationship. Other evidence presented in court reportedly suggested that people around Burke may have known Celeste was spending time with him. The defense has also raised questions about whether Celeste's family knew about the relationship. These issues are complicated, and they should not be reduced to a simple conclusion. Knowing someone exists is not the same as knowing the full nature of a relationship. And knowing that a teenager is spending time with an adult does not necessarily mean knowing what is happening behind closed doors. The important point is that investigators were attempting to establish who knew what and when. That became particularly significant because of the February 2024 welfare check. By that point, according to the prosecution's evidence, Burke had already been questioned about Celeste's age. Yet prosecutors allege the relationship continued, and over the following months, investigators say the messages on Burke's phone began to reveal a much more complicated picture. There were discussions about their future. There were conversations about Celeste leaving home. There were references to marriage and living together. And there were communications that prosecutors later described as evidence of increasing tension. The relationship was no longer simply a background detail. It was becoming the central question in the investigation. By early 2025, Burke's career was moving forward. Celeste was still a teenager, and according to prosecutors, the relationship between them had become increasingly complicated. Investigators would later examine messages exchanged between the two during this period. Those messages became important because prosecutors argue they showed conflict and instability in the relationship. The preliminary hearing also brought attention to another person in Burke's life. Prosecutors presented evidence involving a woman named Azia Collins, whose relationship or friendship with Burke became relevant to the messages exchanged with Celeste. According to testimony reported from the hearing, Celeste was upset about Burke's connection with Collins. The prosecution has argued that tensions escalated around this period. At some point, according to prosecutors, Celeste allegedly threatened to expose Burke. That claim is central to the prosecution's theory of motive. But here again, the evidence must be considered carefully. The existence of a threatening message does not, by itself, prove what happened afterward. It becomes significant only when placed alongside the rest of the evidence. And prosecutors believe that the timing matters. They allege that the relationship was approaching a breaking point. Burke's music career was expanding. His debut album was approaching release. And Celeste, prosecutors argue, possessed information that could have caused serious consequences for him. The defense has presented a different interpretation. During the preliminary hearing, defense attorneys highlighted messages from Celeste and questioned aspects of the relationship's history. That means the eventual trial will not simply be about what prosecutors say happened. It will also involve a debate over what the evidence actually proves. And that debate begins with the final days. Because by April 2025, investigators say the relationship had reached a critical point. On April 23, 2025, prosecutors allege that Celeste went to Burke's Hollywood Hills residence. According to the prosecution's theory, that was where the events leading to her death occurred. The exact sequence of what happened inside the home remains one of the most important questions in the case. Investigators have attempted to reconstruct those events through a combination of evidence, phone data, vehicle information, digital communications, forensic findings, and evidence recovered months later. Prosecutors allege that Burke killed Celeste during an encounter that followed the escalating conflict between them. They further allege that he then attempted to conceal what had happened. The prosecution's theory is that the concealment continued for months, but there is a critical limitation. The public does not yet have a complete, independently established account of every moment between Celeste's arrival and her death. Much of what is known comes from the prosecution's reconstruction of the evidence. That is why the upcoming trial matters. A preliminary hearing determines whether enough evidence exists for the case to proceed. It does not determine guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And the judge's decision on July 27, 2026, was not a conviction. It was a ruling that the evidence was sufficient for Burke to face trial. That trial will eventually require prosecutors to prove their case to a jury. But even before the trial begins, investigators have assembled a timeline that prosecutors say connects April 23 to what happened next. And that timeline takes us away from the Hollywood Hills home. It leads to a Tesla, and eventually to the discovery that changed the case forever. If you found this breakdown helpful, subscribe to Brian Case Record and turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay respectful of everyone affected by this case, and we'll see you in the next investigation.